Here is an update of the garden near the end of June. The tomato plants are now about 8 feet tall from the soil, and they're still growing. These things are huge. There is no insect damage whatsoever, and they're all growing very, very well. I'm using a drip irrigation system to water them every other day at this point. And every week, once a week, I apply foliar feeding of evaporated sea minerals, Epsom salt, organic fertilizer, crushed garlic, and crushed onion. Applied to the leaves, all over the leaves with a sprayer. That, the trace minerals keeps the insects away by protecting the plant and providing it an immune response to the insects. In fact, I often see dead bugs just sitting on the surface of the plant that were otherwise trying to eat it. It kind of makes them, well, let's just say that the bugs will not respond very well to eating these plants. The garlic and the onion acts as a repellent to just sort of make them not even want to try. Now, these here are black Krim from the Isle of Krim off the coast of Russia. These plants end up looking about purplish blackish, and they end up with a naturally salty flavor. These are heavy producers, but these are just growing like crazy. There are about 45 black Krim that will be ready to harvest probably in the first week of July. And seriously, these things get big. Now, the real problem we have with them is that they're just growing everywhere. I've been using these lines to just try to hold some branches up. One method we use to grow them is to mound around them to thicken up the branches, but I have to repeatedly prune back excess. Now, we have been allowing these to grow in excess. We've been letting them branch out and intermingle, and that's making this really bush-like. The advantage of that is we'll get more tomatoes. The disadvantage is that they'll be smaller. Of course, trace minerals tend to make vegetables larger regardless, so we're not worried about that. Now, that's just one type of the tomato though. We also have coming in the Juliet tomatoes, which usually form around the size of grapes. Now, I've seen them about this big in grocery stores, but they're not even done growing. These things are just huge. Now, this is just one branch that I allowed to grow out, and I'm using these stakes to extend them over the kale because with the direction of the sunlight, it's just using more space. The kale, as you can see, is doing very well. There is still some insect damage, obviously, from the week that I didn't do a foliar feeding, but most of these new leaves are just beautiful. Now, I've noticed that there are moths that occasionally fly around the garden, and those things are not as repelled as other things, so I think that they are part of what gets at the garden. But even with some damage from insects, the method of trace minerals to increase yield, it just makes up for whatever they take. There's just so much to harvest, and it's going to be so good for me too. Here's another tomato that's coming in, and they have like probably the largest leaves I've ever seen on a tomato plant. Right here, you could see this spot here. The branch actually half broke, and I repaired it by moistening some nori, which is a seaweed you put around sushi, and organic uncooked nori. Moistened it, wrapped it around the edge, and then I tied it to this post. This is actually hardened, formed a effective bandage, which also has regenerative properties that help the plant heal. And the plant is not phased one bit. I'm not entirely sure what type of tomato this is, but I'm sure I'll find out eventually. Now up here in the second tier, or actually the third tier, the bottom tier is the flower garden, we have some new sprouts coming in. This is carrot seedlings. And this is, I believe, the radish. Yeah, these are the radish seedlings. I planted the radish and the carrot alongside each other because the carrot harvests a month after the radish. Now it's okay to allow multiple sprouts next to each other because these are root plants, and they'll just cluster just fine. You end up with a higher yield, even if a slightly smaller size, by letting them cluster. In this middle bit we have romaine coming in, just a few seedlings here and there, and they're coming along. Right here we have broccoli. Now it's a little known fact that the broccoli you see in grocery stores are really the flowers. There is some slight insect damage from recently being transplanted, but I applied a foliar feeding last night. And here's sweet pepper, and these guys keep trying to produce peppers. When you're growing pepper, you always have to repeatedly clip off whatever fruit it grows and whatever flowers it grows, because it will start producing really quickly. But if you cut those out, then you get a higher yield later in the season. And over here we have 6 more tomatoes planted. Now, an interesting thing about this is that these were all planted around the same time as those, but these were kept as seedlings in a small container. So they're a bit smaller, but here's something else about this. When we planted them just last week, they weren't this tall. We actually dug about a 1 to 2 foot deep hole, cut all the branches up, and then buried it to allow the stem to thicken. And they've just grown out from there. Some not as much, depends on the variety. That one's still kind of small. I'm also putting in stakes like this. This is a Juliet tomato. Its branch just coming out, and I'm pointing it up like this. I put in this metal line when I put the soil in, and the string going across, just to give the tomatoes something else to hold on to. And I still have to put some stakes in the ground. Now in the backer of tomatoes we have the giant tomatoes, and they are just now starting to come in. These ones are the slowest growing tomatoes in the whole patch. So I expect we'll have a smaller yield of them, but these guys, they're just taking off now. I mean, this thing is starting to overtake even the height. In fact, this giant tomato is now the tallest one in the whole patch, and it was the slowest growing. So let's see, we have quite a bit of different things coming in. The only thing that concerns me is the vines coming off the edge over the property line. I've got to start trimming these down a bit to keep them from just overtaking everything. They're just really growing like crazy. Now a quick thing here, these are called suckers. Now there's 2 approaches we can apply here. If we cut out the sucker, you'll have less tomatoes to bloom, but you'll get larger tomatoes. So we're leaving them in because we don't have to worry about the size. We have enough trace minerals and nutrients to allow for double the size if we really wanted to. As you can see here, there's some dead bugs on the surface of this. If you look really closely, those little black spots are dead bugs. That's because they try to feed into it and then they just die. They cannot process this material. The trace minerals just end up being toxic to all the little critters that just try to eat the plants. But trace minerals, they're not pesticides. They are a full range of nutrients that we need in our bodies. They make the plants healthier, and in turn they make us healthier. So anyway, this is the garden. It's all coming along, and we'll enjoy a very bountiful harvest very soon. One last thing though. There is a method of gardening I kind of stumbled into. Right here is another tomato plant. Now this one's not looking as well, but here's the story behind it. That is a branch that actually just broke off of one of the crim tomato plants. I just stuck it in the ground. It wilted slightly and then made a comeback. This tomato is thriving despite being just a branch. In other words, it will grow from the cutting very easily. I've tried it with smaller cuttings and it hasn't worked. So it needs to require a bit of a substantial size. Now, up here is one I've recently put into a pot. Last night it was doing really well. It's at the wilting stage now. What I did is I cut out the branches. I staked it into the ground all the way in. I let a little bit sticking out here and there. And I've been using a foliar feeding daily at this point because the leaves can absorb moisture as well. overall, everything's doing very well, and I expect that this will be able to grow indoors. Remember, tomatoes are perennials, not annuals. So I'm going to be using this to be able to start producing tomatoes by winter. And I'll have an indoor tomato plant ready. Over here is where we're going to start putting in a new garden area. There's not going to be anything planted here until next year, but we're going to start in the frame. About a 5-foot by 10-foot area. And up here there's going to be a fence post about 4 feet above the new ground level, so I'm not going to have to bother seeing that fence anymore. And then we'll be able to start having even more harvests next year. Enjoy the garden. I know I am.